It's my pleasure to introduce Kate Bradwell. Dr. Bradwell has been working in the National COVID Cohort Collaborative for the last 3 years, and I've been actually working with her in that time in different capacities. Before coming to Palantir, her focus was on bioinformatics and genomics projects, including programming and high-performance computing, both in commercial and basic research institutions in multiple countries, and a range of biology-focused work. In N3C, though, she's been invaluable to the entire community. In terms of creating constructs in OMOP that all analysts use, concepts like pregnancy and other core issues, working with the domain teams to accomplish the analysis, developing core methods. For instance, an important one was how to rescue data, that lab data that was submitted without any units of measure. And we published we saved about 80% of the data, rescued that data. And then finally, a lot of machine learning algorithms and analyses, again, to help all these domain teams. So she and I have been working on this protocol pad concept that I'm eager to hear her presentation. So without further ado, Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Harold, for this great introduction. And thanks to all at JHU for inviting me to speak on this topic. I think it's a topic relevant for many researchers performing a variety of different types of research. But I'll be focusing on observational EHR, electronic health record research in the context of the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, N3C. So the talk is titled Collaborative Team Science and Reproducible Research Methods for Observational Studies with N3C Protocol Pad. And so just a disclosure, I am an employee of Palantir Technologies. So the objectives of this presentation are to define team science, reproducible research, computable science, describe the design goals of an interface that documents protocols, describe the design of the protocol pad interface, relate the experience that we've received from users who have so far used the interface. And I'd like to thank a variety of people. So the ADMS, Applicable Data Methods and Standards, cross-cutting domain team in N3C. So the National COVID Cohort Collaborative is a platform, an enclave of patient data that researchers can perform observational research on the patient data and use a variety of analytic tools. And we also have a variety of teams that either perform specific domains of research, such as pregnancy, Alzheimer's, etc., or there to actually support researchers, and ADMS is one of those groups that is supporting researchers, for example, with statistical advice and decision support. We also have a variety of researchers in other domain teams that have helped out, Jared, Kim, etc., which we're very grateful for providing feedback. And I'd like to thank my team as well at Palantir Technologies, Amin, Maya, Saad, Andrew, for their feedback and support while developing this interface to document protocols. So as I said, our aim, and from the title of this presentation, the aim is to develop an interface which helps researchers who are performing observational research on the patient data to document their protocols, document their methodology, what the design of their study is, what the methodology steps are, and then produce a final document which really helps people understand exactly how they've performed their study and exactly why they've made the choices they have in terms of the methodology for answering research questions for a study. So what is reproducible research? So we want to permit the reader of a paper to see the entire processing trail from the raw data and code to figures and tables. So the criteria for reproducible epidemiologic research includes components such as data methods, where you're making your code available in an understandable form, documentation, so adequate documentation of any code, software environment, for example, packages used, and distribution, so standard methods, software data and documentation. And in N3C, we're really allowing anyone that submits a data use request from an academic institution to perform research on the patient data with approval from a data access committee. And so there's a unique environment in N3C of open team science. And so it's a variety of researchers that may not have met each other before, but they request to join specific data use request projects that are researching specific topics on the observational EHR data. And so they all work together to perform this kind of iterative process of explore, refine, produce. So as we know in a study, there's a lot of exploration and dead ends that occur at the beginning, and you can learn a lot from negative results as well as results that have worked. So this diagram on the right shows this process of you're performing a lot of exploratory analysis, cleaning the data, comparing to expectations and outputs. And then you're entering a refine phase where you might be improving your methodology and expanding your data management, maintain reproducibility by documenting what you're doing and what has worked, the path of decision-making that leads to you actually answering your research questions for your study. And then at the very end, you hopefully produce a very clear piece of documentation, which allows other researchers to understand what you've actually done. And the term protocol is a term that is used across many different domains of research and across different kind of areas of research, such as observational EHR research, clinical trials, even kind of omics research, wet lab research. You're making protocols to describe the actual set of steps and considerations, the design, what statistical analysis has been done, or what, if you're developing an algorithm, how was that implemented? So just making sure that everything is documented. And that's what we mean here by protocol as well. So these are just example components of a protocol. You start with what you intend to do, you iterate, and then you describe what was actually implemented at the very end. So why actually document or computerize protocols? So internally for the research team, for example, as you're answering questions for a research study, you might be developing computational components such as variable definitions, concept sets, say for a specific condition that a patient has, things that can be useful throughout many different manuscripts or for different parts of a manuscript. So it's important to document these things within your team so that everyone understands clearly how you've defined the components of your study, and they can then reuse them. It's important to document your protocols to speed up manuscript preparation as well. So if you document as you go along, it's a much easier process actually translating that into a final manuscript, as we know. Externally, so for example, other researchers might want to then later on follow your methodology steps that you performed in your protocol and make sure that they can actually translate what you've done into something that can be put in place for their study. So the ability to actually harmonize and integrate the methodology and results in a way that can be implemented in other situations or other kind of, say, instances of EHR or other data sets is very important as well. So this is a diagram that Harold has put together, which shows the overall process. So in the beginning in N3C, as I mentioned, you have to write a data use request to perform observational research on the patient data. This also involves IRB. And so this is the very first step. And then you're performing exploratory analysis, writing your code, developing, say, a phenotype, collecting, cleaning the data, performing the analysis, and also making sure that the methodology you produce is conforming to a methodology checklist. For example, have you accounted for certain limitations and biases? Have you accounted for generalizability? Have you performed sanity checks while you're performing the analysis, etc.? And then you're making sure, ideally writing up as you go along the method section and the results section for your paper. So what is out there publicly available to actually document protocols in a structured way? So there's various kind of platforms such as Galaxy, which allow you to document your work, document your workflows, provides decision support such as popular next step kind of suggestions. But there's also kind of a more general platform or tools such as protocols.io that allow you to document your protocol no matter what type of protocol it is. So for example, like wet lab protocol, like preparing your RNA-seq analysis, for example, performing observational EHR research, that can all be documented in protocols.io, which is available online. It's also a collaborative environment. You can set up a shared kind of workspace where you can, multiple people can work on the steps of your protocol here. So this is very useful, but it's very general in that you can't document in a structured way the components necessary for your particular area of research. For example, in observational EHR data, you might want to have a structured way of documenting concept sets and variables, and have a form that allows you to capture information about those specific elements more easily. So that's kind of more a difficult process in this kind of very general interface. So what we kind of wanted to do is kind of capture this process that you're seeing here in as general way as possible, but also supporting observational EHR research. So having elements of a documentation tool for protocols that enables you to capture observational EHR components in a structured way, but also not being very specific on what particular study type is being documented. So within observational EHR research, there's kind of methods, papers you can produce, such as, for example, I worked on a paper which defines pregnancy, develops an algorithm to define pregnancy in the EHR data, as Harold mentioned at the beginning. And so that's a purely methods-based paper. We also have things like descriptive research papers for observational EHR. You have analytic, cohort case control, cross-sectional studies. So we really wanted an interface that didn't exclude anyone for just the particular study type they're trying to perform. So as I mentioned, trying to be as broad as possible in terms of the study types dedicated for, focusing on allowing documentation with a view to produce a manuscript or make the translation into a manuscript easier, linking to relevant resources and structured forms to capture the elements that you need to capture for observational EHR research, and also being pretty broad in the target users, so experienced, non-experienced users, informaticists, and actually learning from the users themselves. So as I mentioned in the beginning, National COVID Cohort Collaborative is an enclave of patient data and analytics tools, which allow researchers from academic institutions to come to conclusions from observational EHR research, and it's an initiative spearheaded by NCATS and CD2H. And you're seeing on the right, on the left-hand side, the homepage for N3C. So we've got 20 million patients. We've got 28.1 billion rows of patient data currently. And you're also seeing some of the elements and tools from the homepage as well, such as administrative resources. So if you want to put in a new data use request, manage your projects if you're a lead of projects. You've also got data analysis and result export resources. So you can see included in that is Protocol Pad to allow researchers to document their methodology for their studies. In terms of the data that's in N3C, you can see on the right, we have this data collection called Data Catalog, and it contains de-identified patient data, limited dataset LDS, and then that's various levels of data access and availability of kind of geographic and non-date shifted information for LDS versus de-identified data. You have PPRL, privacy preserving record linkage data sets, and you have a variety of external data sets also that have been approved for use combined with the patient data. So in N3C, what do we particularly mean by a protocol? It's a definition of materials and methods for an observational study on real-world data to obtain real-world evidence. So the development process of this interface was very, very iterative. It involved, as I said, the support of the ADMS domain team and logic liaison team in N3C, coming to many agreements on components, many user interface iterations, some AI prompt engineering, because there are AI components to Protocol Pad, and making sure that it has researcher value, trying to decide what to develop versus what to postpone, what are the elements that are more challenging to implement in terms of what's available currently on the platform, the analysis platform. So the main goals are to provide a more structured, clear methodology documentation for studies, and to define variables, to have assistance from AI, for example, to expedite the precise language or language and elements to include in, say, a materials and methods section of a paper, because oftentimes when researchers are writing up materials and methods, they leave out key components that allow you to reproduce the work. So we're trying to improve that kind of scenario. So the interface itself was a space to allow documentation of all researchers' N3C protocols, and have 3 phases: design, develop, and complete for the protocols. So different kind of tools and support for those different phases that you go through while you're developing a study. And key components, linked tools are support from an LLM, ChatGPT-4. Also, protocol browser is linked. So when you finally complete your protocols, you can make it public and actually display your protocol for other people to learn from in the enclave. Variable dictionary, so a study variable dictionary where you can define what your key components of your study are. For example, defining conditions, which may require multiple, say, concept sets, which are a collection of concepts from the OMOP vocabulary that we're using that define particular, say, conditions or measurements. And also link variables to code as well, so that it's clear how those variables were defined. And so we just wanted to make sure there's a lot of kind of connected components to this interface as well. And speaking of the connections, Protocol Pad does not operate in isolation. As I said, we have a study variable dictionary interface, which is optimized for researchers to record their specific study variables. A public enclave-wide protocol browser where finished protocols can be viewed by everyone. So these 3 components are tightly linked together. but also all the components linked to other kind of tools in the N3C enclave, such as the knowledge store, which is a collection of reusable code and documentation that goes along with the code. So for example, say code templates to define a specific condition, or to perform, say, propensity score matching, things that are useful broadly across many different projects can be deposited as code in the knowledge store. So that is also linked to the protocols and variables that are defined. And also the concept set library. As I said, a concept set is a collection of synonyms that may, for example, just be different ways of saying a specific condition or a specific measurement that you want to just collect together, so that every time you find those instances of those concepts in the data, you know it's referring to the same thing. So elements of a protocol. So we start with the purpose and the design. We define variables, the key variables that are important to for the methodology. The set of steps that are required to complete the methodology, and then documentation. So things that we wanted to incorporate, so protocol history, what are the changes that have been made to the protocol, documentation, linking to computable resources, such as items in the knowledge store, generate a protocol summary at the very end, which is the element that gets surfaced in the protocol browser, and generate a methods section or methods text that is kind of guiding researchers in what they need to include in any kind of manuscript method section. So really, it's not just me presenting. I'd like kind of the audience to give feedback after as well, and just trying to get opinions on what are the elements that you'd want to see in said type of interface to define protocols for a study and their variables. Once I show the screenshots of the interface, are there any elements that you feel are missing or could be improved? What elements should be captured for study variables, and how should that be translated into information for a manuscript and study? Any other features or elements? When a protocol is defined in N3C, what do you see as a potential use or value of the protocol overview document that's produced at the end? Should this be used as supplementary material text to submit to a journal article? What are your thoughts on the integration of AI? Are you okay with it assisting with suggestions for materials and methods text for a journal article? And any other thoughts on the overall infrastructure? So this is the landing page of Protocol Pad when you log into the interface. So you have your list of any existing protocols. I've just shown some example protocols that I created here. And it shows the research project that time created, the protocol creator. You have an option to create a new protocol. When you create a new protocol, you give it a title. It shows you as the creator. You can set editors as well. So specific people that are allowed to make changes to the protocol, such as key analysts that are involved in the study. You can select a research project, and you can state objectives. So what is the protocol trying to achieve? What are the study objectives? Then you choose a specific study type. And there's also, based on your study objectives, a suggestion by a feature we've called AIPI, which suggests what type of study you have described in your study objectives. So you're saying, I want to develop an algorithm to define pregnancy, that would be a methods study. So you get assistance with actually choosing what type of study it is: methods, descriptive, cohort, case control, or cross-sectional. Then you can set general properties for your protocol. Again, you have AI assistance, suggestions on the potential methodology that you might want to use. And you can define study variables. So, for example, in the pregnancy work, preterm birth, this was the definition. So outcome of pregnancy episodes were a concept within the preterm birth concept set was found between the start and end date of the inferred pregnancy episode, or pregnancy episodes whose pregnancy start date to pregnancy outcome date spans less than 37 weeks. So anyone that's new to pregnancy research that wants to join the pregnancy domain team, these variable definitions are very useful. And also it's very useful to distinguish what's the clinician or clinical type definition versus informatically what needs to be done to define that variable. I think those are two components that are very useful for people to understand. And so the structure of how we've allowed definition of variables takes that in mind. And there are concept sets, as I said, knowledge store code that can be linked to the definition. So as I said, this is the form, these are the components that you can fill in to define your study variable. So what's the variable type, data type, what are you expecting to see in a column that defines your variables, for example, in the data? What's the source of your variable definition? Any discussion points? So what were the things in the EHR data that maybe changed your way that you had to define the variable? And those are important things for other people to bear in mind as well. So moving to the protocol development, we have a way for researchers to set up their set of steps and sections. So main tasks they need to perform for their study in the methodology development. And that links also to electronic lab notebook, where you can actually document your daily work for performing specific steps. So this really helps you organize project planning, assigning specific sections or steps to specific analysts. So this is very useful, for example, if you have a large group that's trying to perform a study, just to be able to coordinate and get everyone on the same page as to progress and tasks that are required. And as I said, this is the process for editing properties of the step you're trying to perform, describing, again, like study variables, the discussion points, what did you need to take into consideration, maybe negative results. So when you try to perform that step for your protocol, what did you need to bear in mind? And the lab notebook, it auto-populates with the protocol name, the section name for the main task you're trying to perform in the protocol, and then the step name as well. And then at the very end, once you've performed all the work and optimized your methodology, you can review and edit the main metadata on your protocol. You can also look at a protocol overview. So this document is auto-generated. And it's also bearing in mind elements of, say, Strobe methodology checklist and any kind of important elements to describe to enable reproducibility of the work, at least in the N3C enclave, any considerations for generalizability outside the N3C enclave. And so it's really guiding the researcher into the type of information that would be needed for others to be able to reproduce the work. And this is all extracted from previous steps that you've filled in your protocol and just formatted in a nice way automatically in this protocol overview document. And this protocol overview document can then be made public. So we have a protocol browser. So these are the protocols currently that have been made public. And you can actually view this protocol overview document information. And this also includes a list of study variables and how they were defined for the study as well. Adding more information about the study variables, we also have a study variable dictionary interface, which enables researchers to actually document and comment on study variables and just be able to kind of iteratively improve their variables via a crowdsourced approach as well. So if other people are trying to use this variable definition, they may notice how some improvements can be made and give feedback to the actual author and say, let's try and improve it in this way, or have you considered this other element that might improve the variable definition? And as I was mentioning at the very end, also suggested introduction and materials and methods text. So mentioning components such as the data release version, information about N3C, mentioning the common data model OMOP that was used and describing it, gathering that information of the definitions for your study variables that you've made via that form. And in that study variable dictionary, and actually summarizing that information to have a key variables section of your materials and methods text. Because oftentimes I read research articles and I'm not entirely sure how people have actually defined their key variables of their study. And so this is trying to enforce or guide researchers to do that in a more formalized way. So also, that said, we do want to make sure that patient data is protected. If someone has, say, mentioned anything about specific patient data in their protocol, we want to ensure that that data never gets out into the public. So there is currently planned a process of actually export, kind of review before export of protocols from the enclave, given that it's patient data. So benefits of actually using the protocol pad interface: organizing work, promoting collaboration, translating work into a final manuscript, increasing research integrity, increasing reproducibility, and facilitating sharing of research methods, for example, variable definitions, etc. And a lot of that is covers this whole process. So from like the initial cohort definition or the outcome definition for a study that you may have, to what your design of your protocol is, gathering the data and variables, performing the analysis. A lot of this process is documented within Protocol Pad and assists with the final manuscript production. So just to go back to the comparison of protocols.io, this interface, protocols.io, is streamlined and well formatted, so you can more easily lay out the sections and steps, and I think that they have a very nice way of doing that. There's also a feature for, if you're trying to reproduce the work, you can have a checklist of the steps and rerun others' protocols. But also it's kind of more of a final document that's produced, and it's more of a retroactive process in many cases. So there is collaborative aspect, but no kind of real-time input, say from AI or any specific elements which can be shown as linked to protocols that are useful for, say, observationally HR research or other elements you might need for specific areas of research. And also lack of modularization. So as I said, no ability to share variables from a study separate to the protocol itself. So it's very much contained within a protocol, the information at least within a protocol. I'd also like to point out that other platforms have attempted also to perform variable definition. So for example, GraphPad or SPSS, they have a way to define variable types, variable labels. So what is the expected information or data type within the variable that you're seeing in the data, define variable properties. So this is all similar kind of to what we're trying to do in allowing definition of study variables. Issues for the future. So naming of variables, how do we resolve the fact that there might be many kind of duplicative variables defined, and how do we surface the differences and compare different variable definitions when there might be many? Showing that there's an attestation from the researchers that the methodology they use actually has worked in the patient data, and providing some kind of evidence for that. Deciding on how best to incorporate and optimize AI to support studies, how to facilitate sharing of protocols inside and outside while still protecting patient data, a lot of these are still items that we're working on and under active development. And so going back to the questions from the audience, so what elements would you like to see in an interface to define protocols for a study and their variables? What elements should be captured for study variables? And how should that be translated into information from manuscript on a study? What other features or elements should be incorporated for documenting informatics EHR studies? When a protocol is defined, what do you see as a potential use and value of this final protocol overview document? Are you in agreement that it should be? Perhaps an extra kind of element that's submitted with supplementary methods for journals. How do you feel about how we've incorporated AI so far in decision-making and documentation for protocols for studies? And then any other thoughts on overall infrastructure for protocol and variable definition for studies? Any thoughts welcome, any suggestions welcome. Thanks all for your time.
Can you summarize like a take-home message that you would send to this audience? How would you articulate what you've learned that has nothing to do with the enclave and the place where this is being developed?
Just trying to make protocol documentation a more seamless and user-friendly experience. Because different people have different approaches to documenting their methodology. And as we all know, materials and methods sections of papers are often lacking. And partly that's to do with not documenting as you go along, not having a structured way of actually documenting what you're doing, especially in bioinformatics and informatics research. So I would say, just trying to bear in mind that different people have different kind of expectations on what they would want to develop protocols or document protocols. Depends if you're a clinician versus informaticist, etc. I think just learning people's different approaches to what they expect in terms of how they want to document their work has been a learning process. Obviously, you have things like Google Docs, Jupyter Notebooks, different tools that people are actually currently using, but it's kind of very disparate kind of tools that are difficult to kind of bring together and actually standardize how people are documenting studies and the methodology for studies. Yeah, that's one thing that really has been surfaced during this whole process.
And the point that you've made to me recurrently is that if you don't make the application useful, it's not going to be used. And it's kind of a dirty secret in informatics that we don't have a good culture of lab notebooks, of recording what we're doing. And you've already alluded to the multiple places. We have Google Docs, we have GitHub, we have multiple places where we keep things. And sometimes it's embarrassing when somebody says, "Oh, let me see the data set," and you can't find it because you can't remember where it is. And so while that is almost a regulatory need, it's hard to get people, when it's not an FDA type of study, getting people to follow good practice is tough. And so we want to make it easy for people to do the right thing, and we want to give them a lot of functionality. One thing that I get from just looking at the interface is it's a complicated environment, and the answer to that is, well, doing this sort of research is complicated, and how to make it simpler is something that you've been struggling with for a long time.
I thought it was a great presentation, and I feel like this is a very big topic, and one of the real challenges we have in real world data, in that it is almost impossible to replicate another investigator's work. And that really prevents a huge barrier for reproducibility. And one of the reasons why observational research is often not used when creating guidelines for clinical evidence. And so I really applaud these efforts. I think you're at the tip of an iceberg of issues. I guess I wanted to start with saying, okay, so I am all in on this method. I am an N3C researcher. I am publishing a paper. How do I cite these artifacts so that someone reading this paper can say, hey, I just need to go here and I can go and pick up where they left off, or see exactly how they calculated BMI for their analysis.
This is precisely the purpose of the protocol overview document, where we want to actually gather the list of variable definitions and list of concept sets and a list of knowledge store items that refer to code that can then be referenced, things like Zenodo IDs for concept sets, having
Yes.
those. So yeah, the whole idea of gathering this final document that describes all these things and suggesting it as used for supplementary methods, I think, is something that could then be referenced by other researchers. I think the challenge is getting researchers to fill in all the elements that then populate that final.
Would you mind describing what Zenodo is for the audience, and what the DOI would be for something like that?
This is a immutable definition that's attached to an ID for Zenodo, where, for example, a set of concepts in a concept set is attached to an ID, and therefore researchers know that if they refer to that Zenodo ID, those list of concepts were the ones that were used in a study. And that it doesn't have to be just concept sets. It can be other kind of definitions, say variable definitions or code. For example, some people try and get a Zenodo unique identifier for a specific version of their code that they used for analysis for a study. I don't know if Harold, you'd have anything to add to that.
I'm going to point out to make it clear that the document that Protocol Pad generates can be submitted as a supplement to the article that you're citing. So you're publishing. So it actually becomes part of the article.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I like the idea. So Zenodo is one open library system where they can provide you document object identifiers that you can make them available over the internet, so people could then go find that computable artifact. And so you're seeing like the document, your main document is like a manifest of a lot of little DOIs for each of the concept sets, for how you prepare the data, for how you analyze the data. And they could be an analytics work product like a Jupyter notebook, or did we lose Kate? Or they could be actual, it could be just, or some other type of computational document like a RStudio markdown file.
Just while she gets her access back, one thing that is not recognized, that the code, you talk about the Jupyter notebook or whatever, when you work in a centralized environment, the code itself could contain PHI. So we're very ANSI. So sharing code is not as simple as it sounds. As it might in an Odyssey environment where you have no access to the actual data. So separating, unfortunately, to make the code publishable requires human intervention to make sure that there's no hidden data. So it's a subtlety that she was talking about.
So in, like, for example, for Jupyter notebooks, they have three components of a Jupyter notebook. One is going to be the analytics, the code that you wrote in. There's going to be the HTML documentation, and then there's going to be the output. And what we do is we'll scrub the output so that if there's no potential presentation of any of the row level data that was part of the document. It would be harder for it to then so basically you could put PHI in, but you'd be typing that PHI into a code document.
Right, and that's what has to be extracted.
Yeah, and
we're just talking about how PHI could find their way into some of the code that we have to.
And I guess the other question I have is, the other thing that I think is interesting is that while you're doing the analysis, how do you consider code versioning systems? Because for a group environment, as they're developing different versions of the code as they're beginning their analysis on the data. Do you see different DOIs for different versions of the code?
One very challenging request we had from a clinician was, when analysts are making changes in the code, what I want from Protocol Pad is to be able to see what those changes were and have them explained to me. And so like the whole process of developing the methodology and the code kind of history was something that a clinician wanted to surface while he was leading a study. And that's definitely technically very challenging to do, but I do see the value in kind of having information about what was the state of code at certain points of development of the methodology. And it's really difficult to follow unless you're someone very technical, like, for example, pull requests for, say, GitHub, or like we have something similar called code repositories in the Enclave, where you can make a pull request and someone can view all the changes on a file at each change and have that saved and documented. That's all fine if you're more of a technical person that is used to the process of pull requests and understanding how to look at those changes. But the challenge, I think, is really surfacing that in a way that more non-technical people can understand.
The file that you would submit as a supplement that you generate with the protocol pad, is that like in a format that is publicly available, that is like XML or JSON that could expose the schema around it? Because the schema should be something that's publicly available.
We don't use we haven't looked at the report, the FIRE report resource as an example. Yep. Right now it is a document that gets published, but that's a good suggestion. I've been advocating us to use evidence resources as well, so that the actual evidence is ingestible, but reasonably. Kate's focus has been on making the system usable before we get to the fancy schmancy stuff.
I think evidence would be a separate document. Would be, here's what we did, and trying to describe exactly what we did to get to that evidence, with the hope that it lowers the barrier for someone else to replicate those results. And so I certainly would love to. I think this is an area that could use. That definitely deserves a lot of research to help us create and see, are there efforts within publishers to create more reproducible research as well? Have you seen any reception from the publishing houses around supporting reproducible, computable components?
In my experience, the focus is on the evidence in that case, because you want the evidence to be synthesizable, so if that's a word. And that's the work that Brian Alper has been doing with computable publishing. I do want to recognize that Anu has a question about the AI part. That I don't know, Kate, if you can see the question: are the AI integrations completely in-house? Do you develop your own LLMs, or is this using something third-party like the ever-present ChatGPT?
So it is using ChatGPT for LLM, yes. But yeah, we're using a specific instance of that doesn't get sent, kind of the information doesn't get sent externally, or like surfaced to anyone externally. I think an alternative was OpenAI, but we're using kind of like a more enclosed instance where the data isn't possible to kind of be sent externally. Yeah, so we have various tools that are developed in the Enclave that help with prompt engineering. I am not familiar with the actual process of iterating and improving any models, because you can have just local models that you bring in and iterate on specifically to improve for specific purposes, but for now we're just using the general chat GPT for.
To our observation, chat and the others as well are not trained on methodology, and they don't understand. It's not, I don't think, and if anybody knows better, I don't think they know methodology at this specific level, at the level of specificity we need. And it's a challenge to get the papers to do that, because because of publishing licensing issues, you can't get the full text paper. You can't get a whole tranche of papers. PubMed does have an open 20% tranche of full text, but it's not. It's hard to know whether it's complete or not to address these questions and to do the training. And for methods, title and abstract is probably not adequate.
I think there's two reasons why people would look at prior literature. One, what is the scientific value of what I'm doing? And two, what's the methodology that can help me achieve what I need to do? And I think we can build, say, LLM tools that help researchers do both. But I think the methodology side would be more challenging.
Sounds like a great PhD project. I don't know, just saying randomly.
If anyone wants to help, yeah, for sure.
One other thing I'd like to highlight is the notion of analytic decision support, where as you're working, the machine kind of understands what you're doing and provides you some knowledge. Like just as a clinical system will give you an alert, we expect our environments to give us help. You saw the little SPSS dialog boxes. They were very nice to talk about the variable type, but it has no idea what you really intend by this variable. It doesn't know what the role of the variable is. It doesn't know what biases or issues would go along with that type of variable for that type of role. Whereas there's so much literature on methods and bias, but none of that can get brought to bear because the machine most of the machines just give you a blank piece of paper. And so part of this is also a platform for that sort of decision support, which is, I think, another feature that we need, because so many analysts are being asked to deal with this real world data without really the training to deal with this real world data.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the challenges is it's unlike, say, Galaxy, which has a set of suggested next steps in workflows. With omics research, there's a lot of kind of protocols and workflows which are very similar, or like slightly different branches to the same thing you're trying to do. So it is pretty easy to show suggested next steps. With observational EHR research, there's a huge array of types of questions that people are trying to answer. So trying to surface like canonical ways of doing XYZ, it's difficult because people are trying to research such vastly different things. And that's the challenge here, I think, for decision support.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that insightful conversation. I think that you're right. There's actually several PhDs worth of material here as we try to make evidence creation in medicine into a reproducible field. I really like I like your presentation on some of the ontologies of the elements and how it affects different researchers conducting the research, as well as other people that later on would want to come back and then replicate it. So Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll see you all back in a month.